The Puffin had always trusted the rhythm of the sea. It was the first sound he heard when he hatched in a narrow cliff burrow, the slow, steady pulse of waves striking stone. The tide shaped everything here, the arrival of fish, the cries of hunting gulls, the timing of his own flights. Even in storm or fog, the ocean below the cliffs was never still, never silent. It breathed, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, but always breathing. This morning, as the Puffin stood alone on a jagged ledge overlooking the northern water, the sea lay flat. Not calm. Flat. He blinked his bright eyes, tilting his head from one side to the other. The air smelled familiar, cold salt, wet stone, but the world felt wrong. The tide should have been rising by now, the swell should have grown, then lifted him gently with its pulse as he took flight. But below him the surface of the water stretched smooth as slate, unbroken from horizon to cliff edge. Not a ripple, not a curve, not a hint of the deep, ancient motion that had always been there. He hopped forward, claws gripping the stone. The absence of wind unsettled him. There was always wind here. Always. It grazed his feathers, ruffled his crest, carried the smell of fish to the colony. But now the sky above him hung like cold metal, unmoving, too still for the hour. He stretched his wings once, testing the air. No lift came. A Puffin's body relied on the wind to catch the edge of a cliff takeoff. Without it, flight felt heavy. He leaned forward, preparing to glide, but hesitated. The sea would not wake. Down below, where other Puffins should have been diving for sand eels, the water showed no movement at all. A few birds circled uncertainly in the distance, calling with sharp, confused notes. They flapped hard, unable to glide. One attempted to dive but pulled up too soon. The mirror-flat surface distorted the depth, giving no sense of where water began. The Puffin looked inland. The cliffs were empty. Normally the rocks teemed with life, pairs chattering, wings beating, chicks squealing. Today, only a handful of Puffins perched silently, each watching the silent sea with the same uneasy posture. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath his feet, not from the earth, but from a boat approaching the base of the cliffs. Humans. Their research vessel nudged quietly across the unnaturally smooth surface, barely leaving a wake. 3 figures stood on its deck, one pointing toward instruments strapped to the railing, another dropping a sensor into the water. The Puffin watched them, head tilted. He trusted humans as much as animals here ever did. Distant figures who came in noisy boats, checked devices, and left again before storms arrived. But today their movements looked tense, hurried. One bent over the sensor, brows furrowed. "Zero wave activity," she said. 0, even with normal tidal pressure. Her colleague shook his head, staring out at the blank horizon. It's like the whole basin is in thermal lock. Surface tensions too high. No mixing layer. The third researcher tapped the side of the boat nervously. The ocean can't turn off. Where is the swell? Where are the upwellings? Where's the wind forcing? Their words meant nothing to the Puffin, but their tone did. Something was wrong with the sea. He edged closer to the cliff's lip. In normal conditions he would have heard the crash of waves, the echo carried upward, bouncing through the stone like a heartbeat. But now the silence frightened him. He opened his beak and made a short grunt, hoping to hear his own voice bounce back. It didn't. Sound faded too quickly in the dense, heavy air. Another Puffin fluttered toward him, wings beating too fast for a bird evolved to glide. She landed awkwardly beside him, feet skittering against the rock. Her feathers were ruffled from exertion. She let out a low growl-like call, nudging him with her beak, urging him to look again. He already was. The sea's surface remained perfect and featureless, reflecting the pale sky like a polished mirror. Even small disturbances, seaweed drifting, fish breaking the surface, were absent. It was a dead calm, but deeper. A calm without breath. The Puffin hopped down to a lower ledge. Normally the rocks here were slick with salt spray. Today they were dry. He tapped them with his beak. Dull, clean, untouched by water for longer than they should have been. He leaned forward, scanning the shallows. Fish should have been schooling, shimmering just beneath the surface. Instead, he saw shadows suspended motionless. They appeared alive but stunned, drifting without rhythm. When the puffin let out a sharp chirp, the fish did not scatter. Fish always scattered. He backed away, feathers fluffed. A gull landed nearby, wings spread wide as if unsure of the ground. It peered at the sea, then at the puffin, then let out a confused cry. Even gulls, bold and foolish, feared something they couldn't understand. Above, thickening clouds formed with unnatural speed, not storm clouds, but a grey low blanket that pressed downward toward the sea. The puffin felt the weight of the atmosphere on his back. The pressure made his breathing shallow. The humans had noticed too. One pointed upward. Pressure's increasing. Ridge formation overhead. No wind exchange. Another tapped a monitor. Surface layers too cool. Deep waters too warm. Nothing's mixing. The first researcher exhaled sharply. The sea is stagnant. Completely stagnant. If this holds, plankton dies first. Then fish. Then everything else. The puffin didn't know their words, but he felt it. The sea below him was not alive in the way it should be. Its pulse was missing. Its voice was gone. He spread his wings and tried to fly again. This time he pushed hard, forcing his body off the rock. He flapped quickly, awkwardly, climbing into the thick, motionless air. Normally a puffin rode the wind, letting it carry him out over the water before diving. But now every meter cost effort. He circled once, twice. The sea did not move beneath him. The cliffs did not echo. The air did not lift. He attempted a dive, folding his wings tightly. But as he neared the surface, something instinctual stopped him. The water felt wrong. Too smooth, too reflective, too still. It tricked the eye. He broke away at the last second, heart pounding. Returning to the cliffs, he landed heavily beside the other puffin. Together they looked out over the silent, breathless sea. If the ocean did not wake soon, if the swell did not return, if the water could not breathe, then the cliffs would empty, the fish would vanish, and the puffin, shaped by tides older than memory, would find himself living above a world that no longer moved. Evening should have brought life back to the cliffs. It always did. As the sun lowered and the light softened, winds usually rose from the sea, slipping along the rock face and fluttering the wings of every puffin preparing to head out for one last dive. The tide should have surged, darkening the shoreline with slow-growing swells. The surface should have rippled with baitfish rising toward the cooler dusk. But as the puffin stood on his narrow ledge, the ocean below remained motionless, a vast, dark sheet without pulse. He opened his beak and let out a rolling croak toward the water. Normally the call would bounce faintly off the moving surface, echoed back to him with a warbling tone. Today it vanished instantly in the heavy air. His chest tightened. Puffins weren't meant to hear silence from the sea. The colony around him grew restless. Pairs wandered along the cliffs, bumping into each other in confusion. Wings that should have been catching the cooling breeze now hung low. A few birds attempted to take off, only to falter mid-air, flapping clumsily without the wind's support. They retreated to the rocks, panting through their open beaks. Fish should have been easier to catch in the evening. Instead, the puffins returned from the water empty-beaked, some dropping from the sky with exhausted landings. A young puffin stumbled near him, shaking droplets from its feathers. But even the droplets looked strange, heavier, almost thick, falling in slow, reluctant arcs instead of the usual misty scatter. He hopped forward and peered down again. The sea had darkened not from wave shadows, but from stillness, a heavy, stagnant darkness. Tiny flecks glowed beneath the surface, shimmering faintly like drifting sparks. At first he thought they were plankton catching the last of the twilight, but as the light faded, the flecks did not move upward. They remained suspended at the same depth, unmoving. Nothing in the sea was moving. Something fluttered above him. A gull. It circled once, then twice, its voice sharp with frustration. It dove sharply at a school of fish that hovered too close to the surface, but instead of bursting into flight, the fish merely twisted weakly, barely scattering. The gull plunged in and emerged with nothing. It screamed angrily and circled again. The puffin blinked. Fish shouldn't behave like that, not even sick ones. He watched as a small cluster drifted to the surface, not floating belly up like the dead, but rising with unnatural slowness, as if the water resisted letting them go. They hovered at the boundary between water and air, fins twitching weakly, eyes wide and glassy. A faint smell reached his nostrils then, metallic, stale, unfamiliar, the scent of water that had not been stirred, not oxygenated, not renewed. He hopped back, uneasy. Below, the human's research vessel drifted closer to the cliffs. The puffin watched the scientists lower another sensor into the water. The buoyant line barely disturbed the surface. One scientist leaned over, frowning intensely. "Oxygen levels are plummeting," she said, voice sharp with worry. "Fish are suffocating at the surface." Another tapped a display screen. "Surface layer is too cool. Deep layer is too warm. Thermal stratification is locking everything in place." The third shook his head slowly. "No wind, no tide movement. This is catastrophic. If the layers don't mix, the whole bay becomes hypoxic." The puffin didn't understand their words, but the tone, a mix of disbelief and fear, pressed against his instincts. He ruffled his feathers uneasily and looked back toward the other puffins. Many had stopped calling altogether. Silence spread along the cliffside like a shadow. He flapped once, twice. The air barely moved under his wings. Still he pushed himself forward and leapt. He fell more than he flew, gliding only a short distance before flapping hard to keep from dropping further. The air didn't lift him. He wrestled against the stillness until he reached the sea. Hovering just above its mirror surface, he spotted a cluster of sand eels beneath him. He aimed, folded his wings. Dove. But the moment his beak touched the surface, he felt resistance thicker than water should be. He pushed downward, but the layer seemed heavy, dense. He broke through, finally reaching the fish. They moved sluggishly, uncoordinated. He snapped one up and forced himself back upward. Breaking the surface was harder. Water clung to him in long threads. He struggled to lift his head. For a terrifying moment, he feared he couldn't rise. Finally, he burst upward, wings flapping frantically. He gained height and angled back toward the cliffs. The effort drained him. When he landed, he collapsed onto his belly, fish still held limply in his beak. Other puffins watched him, but didn't move. Their own attempts had failed. A few held small fish, but most had returned empty. Chicks waiting in burrows deeper in the cliffs chirped faintly, hungry and confused. Parents responded weakly, unable to feed them enough. The sea that once fed thousands now starved them. The puffin listened again for waves. Nothing. Listened for wind. Nothing. Listened for tide against rock. Nothing. A deep rumble shook the air. The puffin startled, but it wasn't thunder. It came from the ocean itself. Not a wave, not a swell, something deeper, resonant, almost groaning. The sea exhaled a long guttural note like trapped energy shifting beneath its unmoving surface. The scientists reacted immediately. "Internal waves," one shouted. "Deep water movement hitting a locked surface." Another paled. "Pressure build-up. If the layers can't equalize." The boat backed away quickly from the cliff wall. The puffin felt the vibration through his feet. He hopped toward the edge, peering downward as the water shivered. Just once, then returned to stillness as if nothing had happened. He didn't know what it meant, only that the sea was no longer behaving like a living thing. He stood there long after the sun set, long after the sky turned blue-black, long after the research vessel's lights retreated into the distance. He waited for the waves that never came. He waited for the wind that never rose. He waited for the sea to breathe again, but the ocean remained trapped in its own silence, and the puffin, shaped by tides and winds and rhythmic hunger, realized that if the water did not wake soon, the cliffs would empty, the colony would starve, and the night-silent sea would take back everything that once depended on its pulse.